He seemed like just another humble employee, but Michael decided to share his meal with him. When that man revealed his true identity, Michael felt his legs give out. Michael sat alone at a metal table in the crowded factory cafeteria. Bright fluorescent lights made the room feel harsh. All around him, workers were eating their lunches and talking among themselves. He opened his lunchbox, took out a simple meal he had prepared earlier, and began to eat. He always ate alone. He had grown used to this routine over the years he had worked at this factory in Detroit, Michigan. The noise of voices mixing with the hum of machines from distant halls was constant here. He did not look up much, just focused on his meal, trying to get through the short break before returning to the production floor. He woke up every morning before sunrise in a modest apartment not far from the factory. He walked to work in the early darkness, clocked in, and spent long hours operating heavy equipment. His muscles were always sore, and he often felt drained by midday. This was normal for him. When his shift ended, he went home, where he took care of his elderly mother. She had a chronic illness that required expensive medicine. He worried about the cost and how to keep up with the bills. He had no choice but to continue working here, day after day. He remembered that his father had once worked at the same factory. His father had died in a work-related accident many years ago. Michael still felt uneasy about that, and it had shaped his view of the company's management. He believed that the managers did not value the workers as people. Instead, they saw them as parts of a machine that produced profits. Michael never expected the supervisors to show understanding or compassion. He had learned that here, no one asked about personal problems or offered any support. He sat in the cafeteria, chewing slowly. His mother's health expenses weighed heavily on his mind. He and his sister often argued about the cost of treatments. There was no easy solution. He earned a modest wage that barely covered rent, groceries, and medical bills. The stress at home was constant. He avoided discussing his problems with anyone at work. He was not close to his co-workers. Everyone seemed occupied with their own struggles, and nobody wanted to hear about someone else's burdens. The cafeteria itself reflected the overall atmosphere of the factory. The tables were lined up in neat rows, the noise level was high, and nobody seemed particularly friendly. Most workers formed small groups, talking in low voices. Some laughed at private jokes, others complained quietly about their supervisors. Michael sat apart, used to being alone. He felt like a silent observer. He saw how quickly kindness disappeared in this environment. Workers were often too tired or too wary to show warmth. The managers rarely appeared in the cafeteria unless there was a reason, and when they did, their presence felt distant and formal. Michael looked down at his lunchbox. He had packed a simple meal, rice, a bit of chicken, and some vegetables. It was not much, but it was enough to keep him going until the end of the shift. He often wondered if there would ever be a change. He did not expect promotions or special treatment, but he sometimes wished someone would notice his effort. He worked hard, never complained openly, and tried to avoid causing trouble. Still, he remained invisible. He understood that this was how things worked here. As he finished eating, Michael recalled the conversation he had with his sister the previous night. They had disagreed about some medical expenses for their mother. His sister wanted to try a different doctor, but Michael was not sure they could afford it. The tension upset him. He wished he could earn more or find a better job, but he knew those options were limited. The economy was tough, and decent jobs were hard to find. He had no special skills beyond operating machinery. He felt trapped, but he tried not to let it show. He put away his empty lunchbox and glanced around the cafeteria. Other workers were still eating. Some looked tired, others looked bored, and a few chatted quietly. Nobody paid attention to him. He wiped his hands on a napkin and stood up. Soon he would return to the production line and continue his usual tasks. The day would pass slowly, and he would repeat this routine tomorrow and the next day, and the day after that. He accepted this reality because he had no choice. Before leaving the cafeteria, Michael paused for a moment. He wondered if there was any way to break the cycle of indifference. He had seen workers come and go. Some left on bad terms, others simply disappeared. Very few seemed to move up in the company. He doubted he would ever be promoted, and he did not see any path toward a better future here. Yet he stayed, because he had responsibilities. He tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on the tasks at hand. He walked out of the cafeteria, heading toward the production floor. The halls were plain and functional. He passed a few supervisors who did not look at him. When he reached his workstation, he started preparing for the next round of tasks. He would cut metal parts, assemble components, and check for defects. This was his day-to-day life. He tightened a bolt here, adjusted a setting there, and kept his thoughts to himself. He did not know that soon, a small act of kindness would change the course of his life. At this moment, he simply followed the routine, unaware of what would come. The next morning, Michael arrived at the factory before sunrise, as usual. He stepped onto the factory floor and took his position, preparing the equipment for the day. During the short morning break, he went to the cafeteria to get a cup of coffee. As he stood by the coffee machine, he noticed a new face among the workers. There was an older man sitting alone at a table in the corner, eating a piece of dry bread. He wore the same uniform as everyone else, but it looked slightly loose and a bit worn out. Michael had never seen this man before. The man's hair was gray, and his face looked tired. Most of the workers ignored him. They focused on their conversations or rushed to finish their snacks. The older man did not approach anyone. He just sat there, chewing slowly, as if he had no other choice. Michael wondered if he was new to the factory. It was not common to see someone alone like this, yet it also did not surprise him. This place was not friendly to newcomers. Michael took a sip of his coffee and watched quietly. He knew how it felt to be alone. He ate alone almost every day. He understood the silence that surrounded people who did not fit into any group. A part of him felt sorry for the older man. He knew that everyone needed a bit of understanding, especially in a harsh environment like this. Still, he hesitated. He was not sure if approaching the man would be wise. Maybe the man preferred to be alone. Maybe he did not want help. A small group of workers passed by the older man's table. One of them glanced down at him, and then turned away. Another smirked quietly. Michael noticed this and felt a slight discomfort. He had seen such behavior before. In a place like this, showing kindness could attract negative attention. People might see it as weakness. Still, Michael thought about his own life. He was tired of seeing everyone treat each other like strangers. He considered that maybe he could show a small gesture of goodwill. He thought about his mother's medical bills and the pressure at home. He thought about how he felt stuck and hopeless most of the time. Helping someone would not solve his own problems, but it might give him a sense that he still had control over how he behaved. He had a choice: ignore the older man like everyone else or do something different. He decided that he would approach him at lunchtime. That would give him a chance to share some food, or at least say a kind word. The morning work session passed slowly. Michael operated his machine, checked measurements, and kept an eye on quality. He followed the procedures carefully, trying to avoid any mistakes that might draw unwanted attention from supervisors. He occasionally remembered the older man's face. He thought about how unusual it was to see someone so quiet and alone on their first days here. He wondered if the man had a family, or if he had come here looking for a stable job. When the lunch break finally arrived, Michael walked back to the cafeteria with his lunchbox in hand. The room was just as noisy as before. Workers crowded around tables, talking about production quotas or weekend plans. Michael spotted the older man at the same table, still alone. The man's meal looked as poor as before. He was eating another piece of dry bread, and nothing else. Michael approached the table and asked if he could sit down. The older man looked surprised. He nodded. Michael opened his lunchbox and took out his meal. He had a sandwich, some fruit, and a small container of cooked vegetables. He offered half of his sandwich to the older man. The man hesitated, then thanked him quietly and accepted the food. They began to talk. Their conversation was simple and calm. The older man said he was grateful for the kindness. He mentioned that times had been hard and he was still getting used to this place. He spoke about how people should treat each other with respect and consideration, even in difficult workplaces. Michael listened carefully. He felt that the older man's words made sense, and he realized that he had not heard anyone speak like this in a long time. The other workers did not pay much attention to them. A few glanced over, but no one interrupted. Michael felt relieved. He did not need approval from the others. He just wanted to share a small act of kindness. As the lunch break ended, Michael packed up the remains of his meal and stood up to return to work. Before leaving, he thanked the older man for the conversation. The man nodded and wished him a good afternoon. On the way back to his workstation, Michael felt a slight change in his mood. He had not solved any of his problems. His mother still needed medicine, and the supervisors were still distant. The factory was still the same harsh place. But he had reached out to someone who seemed even more alone than he was. That action reminded him that he had the ability to choose how to behave, even in a place where kindness was rare. He returned to his station and resumed his tasks, feeling a small sense of relief that he had done something good, no matter how small. That afternoon, Michael continued his shift on the factory floor. The steady hum of machines and the clank of metal parts surrounded him as he focused on his work. He tried not to think too much about the conversation he had during lunch. Still, the memory lingered in his mind. He had shared part of his meal with a man who was new here. That man had spoken about respect and empathy in the workplace. Michael considered how unusual that was. Most people in this factory did not discuss such things. They complained about workloads, wages, or the supervisors, but few talked about treating each other well. Michael realized that he had enjoyed hearing those words, even if the older man had shared only a few simple thoughts. It made Michael feel that maybe he was not alone in thinking there could be a better way to treat each other. As the afternoon wore on, Michael noticed that a few co-workers were watching him more closely than usual. One passed by and gave him a curious look. Another said nothing but raised an eyebrow. Michael pretended not to notice. He knew that some workers might find his behavior strange. After all, most people kept to themselves. Reaching out to a newcomer might be seen as wasting time or trying to look good. Michael did not want to appear different, but he also knew he had done the right thing. When the final break of the day arrived, Michael took a quick rest near his station. He drank some water and stretched his arms. His supervisor walked by, glanced at him, and then moved on without a word. Michael felt tense, but there seemed to be no immediate trouble. He returned to work, assembling parts and checking that everything met the required specifications. By the end of his shift, Michael felt the usual fatigue. His back ached from standing for hours, and his hands were stiff. Before leaving, he looked around, trying to catch a glimpse of the older man. He spotted him on the opposite side of the floor, moving slowly toward the exit. The man looked tired, but calm. Michael considered walking over to say goodbye, but there were too many people in the way. He decided to let it go for now. Outside, the sky was dark. Michael started the walk home. The neighborhood was quiet, and the streetlights buzzed softly. He thought about what awaited him at home. His mother would need help with dinner and medicine. He would probably have another conversation with his sister about finances. He hoped that the slight positivity he felt would help him remain patient and avoid an argument. Upon arriving at his apartment, Michael greeted his mother, who rested in a chair by the window. She asked how work was. He answered honestly that it was the same as always. She nodded, understanding that he rarely had good news about his job. He heated some soup for her and checked that she had taken all her medications. Later that evening, his sister came by to discuss their mother's next doctor's appointment. They went over the costs, the insurance details, and the price of medication. It was not pleasant, but they kept their voices calm this time. Michael thought about the older man's words concerning empathy and respect. If he could show kindness to a stranger at work, perhaps he could also find a better way to talk with his sister. He listened carefully to her concerns and agreed that they needed to find some way to reduce expenses without sacrificing their mother's care. After settling these matters for the night, Michael went to bed. He lay awake for a while thinking about the factory, the older man, and the future. He did not have any grand plans, but he felt slightly less trapped. He remembered the older man's quiet confidence and gentle tone. It occurred to him that maybe he should pay more attention to how people treated each other. Even if he could not change the big picture, he could control how he interacted with others. The next morning came too soon. Michael got up before sunrise, prepared a quick breakfast, and headed back to the factory. The routine never changed. He entered the building, passed through the same corridors, and set up at his workstation. Before the shift started, he noticed the older man again, standing near a stack of boxes. Michael gave a small nod of greeting. The man nodded back, then returned to his task. The day's work began as usual. The factory was loud and busy. Supervisors walked around with clipboards, checking quotas and deadlines. Workers focused on their tasks, trying to avoid mistakes. Michael kept his head down and did what he was supposed to do. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind he wondered if the older man had a reason for speaking about respect and empathy. Perhaps he had seen too many workplaces where people forgot to treat each other well. As lunchtime approached, Michael felt a slight tension building. He considered whether he should join the older man again. Would that draw unwanted attention? He decided to try anyway. When he entered the cafeteria, he spotted the man sitting alone once more, now with a slightly larger piece of bread and a small carton of milk. Michael approached and asked if he could sit down. The older man agreed. Today, Michael offered some fruit from his lunchbox, and they ate quietly at first. The older man asked Michael about his workstation. He seemed genuinely interested. Michael explained what he did and mentioned how repetitive the tasks felt. He also told him about how many workers felt pressured to meet quotas without much support. The older man listened carefully, nodding now and then. Michael asked if he was adjusting to the job, and the man replied that he was learning about the conditions here. He said it was important to see how people behaved under stress. Michael did not fully understand why the older man spoke in this way, but he appreciated his calm attitude. He noticed that a few workers were staring at them again, but he ignored it. After lunch, Michael returned to the floor and resumed his duties. He felt a bit more confident now. He had made a small connection, and nothing terrible had happened because of it. As the day ended, Michael realized he was thinking a bit differently about his situation. He still had the same financial troubles, the same worries about his mother, and the same low-paying job. However, he now believed that treating people with kindness might matter more than he thought. He closed his locker and headed out the door, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next day started as usual, but by mid-morning something changed. Michael was working at his machine, checking parts for defects, when suddenly the machine made a strange grinding noise and stopped. He tried to reset it, but it would not start. He called over his supervisor, who arrived with a displeased look on his face. The supervisor asked what Michael had done to the machine. Michael explained that he had followed standard procedure. The supervisor frowned and told him to wait while he called a maintenance technician. Michael stood there, feeling uneasy. He knew that downtime would affect the day's production totals, and that never pleased the management. A few workers passed by, looking curious about the sudden halt. One co-worker smirked at Michael and shook his head, as if blaming him. Michael wondered if someone had tampered with the machine. He had heard rumors of workers who tried to make others look bad by causing minor breakdowns. He had no proof, but he felt suspicious. If that was true, it meant someone might be targeting him out of envy or resentment. As the technician arrived and began to inspect the equipment, Michael felt a growing tension in his chest. He could not afford to lose this job. He had too many responsibilities. If management believed he was incompetent, they could issue a warning or even consider replacing him. He remained silent, watching the technician work. After some time, the technician said a small part had been dislodged, but it was unclear how it happened. The supervisor gave Michael a hard look, then told him to get back to work once the machine was fixed. Michael nodded. He tried to remain calm, but inside he felt angry and worried. Had someone set him up? At lunchtime, Michael entered the cafeteria feeling uneasy. He wondered if the older man would be there again. He spotted him in the same corner, eating another simple meal. Michael approached and asked if he could join. The older man said yes. Michael tried to keep his voice low, not wanting to attract attention. He told the older man about the broken machine. He admitted that he suspected someone might have done it on purpose to make him look bad. The older man listened carefully, then said it was possible. He explained that in places where workers felt neglected or under pressure, some tried to advance by harming others. He advised Michael not to jump to conclusions, but to be careful and keep his eyes open. Michael appreciated the advice. He understood that this man saw the situation clearly. Something about his manner suggested he was not just a regular worker. He seemed too observant and too calm under these conditions. Yet Michael had no reason to doubt him. The older man had been kind and understanding, and he had never asked for anything in return. After lunch, Michael faced a lecture from his direct supervisor, who blamed him for slowing down production. The supervisor did not want excuses. He just said that Michael should be more careful. Michael accepted the criticism quietly, not wanting to start an argument he could not win. That afternoon, Michael worked harder, double-checking everything he did. He tried to ignore the feeling that someone might be watching him. He tried to keep his mind on the job. He knew that one mistake could cost him more than he could afford. He operated the machine with extra caution until the end of the shift. When the day ended, Michael went home feeling discouraged. He had tried to do something good by reaching out to the older man, but now he felt more pressure than ever. He also remembered the conversation from the previous night with his sister and mother. He had responsibilities waiting at home. There was no room for failure. At home, Michael found his sister reviewing medical bills again. They needed to schedule another appointment for their mother. The cost would be high. Michael swallowed his frustration and agreed that they would find a way. His mother needed proper care. He could not let a work problem ruin the support he provided for his family. As he got ready for bed, Michael considered his options. He could look for another job, but that was risky. He had no guarantees he would find anything better. He could try to report his suspicions about sabotage, but he had no evidence, and he knew the supervisors would not believe him without proof. He had no choice but to keep his head down and continue working as best as he could. That night, he slept poorly. He dreamed about broken machines and angry supervisors. He woke up feeling tired and worried about the future. Still, he forced himself to follow his routine, heading back to the factory before sunrise, preparing to face another day of hard work and uncertainty. The next morning, the tension was noticeable. Workers seemed on edge. Michael heard whispers that the company's directors were paying close attention to everyone's behavior. Some said that promotions were coming, while others said layoffs were possible. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone felt nervous. Michael tried to ignore these rumors, focusing on his tasks. However, he noticed a few people glancing his way, as if checking how he would react to this news. He wondered if his small act of kindness toward the older man had somehow attracted attention from the wrong people. He kept quiet and did his work. As the day moved forward, Michael felt more isolated. He could not trust anyone, and he felt pressure from every side. He thought about the older man's advice. He would keep going, do the right thing, and avoid reacting with anger. He knew that giving in to fear or suspicion would solve nothing. By the end of the day, Michael was called into the supervisor's office. He expected bad news, maybe a formal warning about the machine breakdown. Instead, he found the supervisor looking tense. The supervisor told Michael to wait because the general manager wanted to speak with him the next morning. Michael's heart sank. He feared the worst, losing his job. He left the office without a word, his mind racing. He had done nothing wrong, but he had no power here. All he could do was show up tomorrow and hope for the best. Outside, he looked up at the dark sky and wondered what would happen next. Early the next morning, Michael arrived at the factory feeling nervous. The previous afternoon, his supervisor had told him that the general manager wanted to speak with him. Michael expected either a warning or bad news. He could not afford to lose this job, but he also knew that things had not been going well. The sabotage he suspected still bothered him. He had no proof that anyone tampered with his machine, but the timing had been suspicious. He waited in a small office near the manager's area until someone called his name. He entered a plain room with white walls and a metal desk. The general manager sat behind the desk, reviewing papers. A supervisor stood to the side, arms folded. Michael remained quiet, waiting to be addressed. The manager looked up and asked Michael about the machine breakdown. Michael explained what had happened. He stated calmly that he had followed all procedures and that the equipment malfunctioned on its own. The manager said that production had slowed down because of this incident. He said the company needed employees to be careful and efficient. Michael insisted that he had done nothing careless. The manager nodded but kept his expression neutral. He then issued a verbal notice, telling Michael to be more attentive. It was not an official punishment, but it served as a warning. Michael felt relieved that he was not being fired, but still upset because it seemed unfair. After the meeting, Michael returned to his workstation. He felt uneasy. He wondered if the co-worker who smirked at him the other day had something to do with the breakdown. He did not know who to trust. Without concrete evidence, he had no choice but to remain quiet and keep working. He spent the morning carefully checking each part he produced, making sure not to make any mistakes. He knew that another incident would place him in a worse situation. At lunchtime, Michael entered the cafeteria with a heavy heart. He spotted the older man sitting alone as usual. The man nodded, and Michael joined him. Michael felt comfortable talking to this man, even though he knew almost nothing about him. He mentioned the meeting with the general manager and how he felt pressured. The older man listened and said that in difficult times, people sometimes tried to harm others to improve their own standing. He advised Michael to stay calm and continue to act honestly. Michael appreciated the man's advice. He offered the older man some of his lunch again, and the man thanked him. Over the brief meal, they discussed the general mood of the factory. Michael said he heard rumors that management was watching the workers closely. The older man nodded and said that many companies tested their employees in subtle ways. Michael did not fully understand what he meant, but he sensed that the older man had insight into how workplaces functioned beneath the surface. After lunch, Michael went back to work. He felt slightly better having talked things through. Still, he was concerned about his home life. That evening, after his shift, Michael walked home thinking about his mother's medical expenses. He worried about how to pay for the next round of treatments. He knew his sister would be anxious, and they would likely end up discussing the same issues again. The stress weighed on him. When he reached the apartment, he found his sister looking through medical receipts. She frowned and showed him the latest costs. Michael said that he understood the urgency, but they needed to keep calm and think it through. His sister argued that they should find a better-paying job or look for a loan. Michael explained that finding another job was risky. They had no guarantees he would earn more elsewhere. The conversation became tense. His sister raised her voice, saying that if he did not try something different, their mother's care might suffer. Michael became defensive, reminding her that he was doing the best he could under difficult circumstances. He told her about the warning he had received at work. He mentioned that leaving now might cost them what little stability they had. His sister sighed and said she understood, but asked him to consider looking for ways to improve their situation. After she left, Michael sat alone with his thoughts. He felt trapped between a difficult job and heavy family obligations. He considered quitting the factory, but then he remembered the older man's words about perseverance. He thought about the quiet understanding he found in those lunchtime conversations. He realized that giving up now would only create more uncertainty. He decided to stay at the factory for the time being, hoping that if he worked hard and kept his head down, things might improve. Before going to bed, Michael wrote down a small budget on a piece of paper. He tried to see if there was any expense he could cut. It did not look promising, but at least he was trying. He reminded himself that he could not control everything, but he could control his own actions. He would try to remain honest and kind, even if others did not do the same. The next morning, he returned to the factory with renewed determination. He greeted no one, just took his place at the workstation and began his tasks. He moved carefully, trying to avoid any possible mishaps. He decided to keep an eye on his surroundings, just in case another attempt to sabotage his machine occurred. He noticed that a few co-workers looked frustrated or tense, but he did not engage with them. By midday, he had completed his assignments without any problems. He felt relieved, but stayed alert. At lunchtime, he went to the cafeteria. The older man was there again, and Michael joined him once more. They ate quietly this time. After a few minutes, Michael thanked the older man for listening to him and for the advice. The man replied that it cost nothing to treat people with respect and understanding, and that such behavior could make a difference. After lunch, Michael went back to the production floor, trying to hold on to that idea. Maybe his small act of sharing a meal and speaking kindly mattered in ways he could not see. For now, all he could do was continue to work and see what happened next. The following day began with a strange tension in the air. Michael noticed that other workers looked nervous. Some whispered in small groups, glancing around as if expecting someone important to appear. There were rumors that high-level directors were observing the workforce. Nobody knew if this meant promotions, pay raises, or layoffs. Everyone felt uncertain. Michael stayed focused on his machine and his tasks. He did not want to get involved in speculation. He knew that rumors only added stress. He inspected each part carefully and completed his assignments one by one. When a supervisor passed by, Michael nodded politely but did not say anything. He had learned to keep a low profile. By late morning, word spread that some employees were being quietly evaluated. Nobody could confirm this, but it created an atmosphere of fear. Michael remembered the older man's advice. Remain honest, show respect, and do your job. He tried to follow that guidance. It was all he could do. At lunchtime, Michael entered the cafeteria. He was hungry and tired, but he also felt curious about whether the older man had noticed the tension. Sure enough, the older man sat in the same spot. Michael joined him, eating in silence for a moment. Then Michael asked if the man had heard the rumors. The older man nodded. He said he had heard many things over the years. He pointed out that when workers felt insecure, they sometimes turned against each other. Michael agreed, remembering the machine breakdown and the suspicious glances. He wanted to ask the older man more questions, but he held back. He did not want to seem too curious. Instead, he just said that he hoped honesty and hard work would be recognized. The older man replied that actions often spoke louder than words. Michael took that as encouragement. He returned to the floor and kept working. He tried not to think about what the directors might be looking for. He believed that if he just continued doing the right thing, he would at least have no regrets. That afternoon, Michael's routine was interrupted when a co-worker approached him quietly. The co-worker asked if Michael had heard anything about changes in management or new company policies. Michael said he had not. The co-worker seemed disappointed and hurried away. Michael sensed that everyone was on edge. Some hoped for promotions, others feared cuts. Michael just wanted stability. After the shift, Michael went home and tried to relax. He spent some time with his mother, helping her with dinner. She asked him how things were at work, and he just said that nothing was certain. She nodded, understanding that he preferred not to discuss the details. He did not want to worry her further. She needed to focus on her health. Later that evening, his sister came by again. This time, their conversation was calmer. She asked if there was any sign of improvement at work. Michael said he could not tell, but he was trying to remain steady and avoid conflict. His sister appreciated his effort to stay positive. They talked about small changes they might make to save money and decided to put aside their arguments for now. Michael went to bed feeling tired, but more at peace than before. He had managed to keep calm at work, even with the rumors. He had kept his family situation stable for now. He knew that nothing had really changed yet, but at least he had not given in to panic or anger. The next morning, Michael arrived at the factory as usual. He set up at his workstation, careful to follow every procedure. He did not want any mechanical issues today. He noticed that a few workers seemed friendlier than before, as if they realized they were all in the same uncertain situation. Others kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact. During a short break, Michael saw the older man carrying a crate of parts. For a moment, Michael felt guilty that he had not offered help. He approached and asked if the man needed assistance. The older man said he was fine. He thanked Michael for asking. This simple exchange made Michael feel a little better. In a place where everyone seemed stressed, even small gestures mattered. As he returned to his machine, Michael wondered about the older man's story. He wished he knew more about this quiet worker who seemed wise and calm. But he respected the man's privacy. He decided that it was enough to know that he could trust someone here, even a little. In an environment so focused on numbers and quotas, that trust felt valuable. By lunchtime, the tension remained, but Michael handled it as best he could. He shared part of his lunch with the older man again, as he had done before. They spoke about general topics, the importance of fair treatment, the need for understanding between employees, and the value of not giving up under pressure. Michael listened carefully, absorbing the man's words. He felt that these conversations balanced out the cold atmosphere around them. After lunch, Michael continued working steadily. He tried to maintain a calm appearance, even though he felt uncertain about what the future held. He stayed quiet, focused on quality and safety. The day passed without incidents. When his shift ended, he was tired but not defeated. He walked out of the factory, looking up at the evening sky. He realized that this pattern of work and worry might continue for a while. He knew he had to stay patient. He had to keep doing his job and caring for his family. He thought about the older man's advice and decided to hold on to it. He would not quit out of fear. He would remain honest and kind, even if the world around him felt tense and uncertain. The factory floor was tense that morning. Michael arrived at his workstation as usual and began his routine. He tried to keep his focus on the tasks at hand, but he felt a tightness in his chest. The uncertain atmosphere, the rumors about evaluations, and the pressure to perform without mistakes weighed heavily on him. He worked carefully, double-checking his measurements before making each cut. A few hours passed without incident. During a short break, Michael stepped away from the noise of the machines to drink some water. He noticed his supervisor talking quietly with another manager. He could not make out their words, but they glanced in his direction once. Michael returned to his workstation, pretending not to notice. Just before lunchtime, a different supervisor approached Michael and told him to report to the manager's office after he finished his current set of parts. Michael felt his heart sink. He asked if there was a problem, but the supervisor offered no details and simply repeated the instruction. Michael nodded and tried to remain calm. He finished his work as instructed, though his hands felt shaky. When Michael finally made his way to the manager's office, he passed through a corridor that was quieter than the rest of the factory. He adjusted his collar and took a deep breath before knocking. A voice from inside told him to enter. He stepped in and saw the general manager, who stood beside the desk. Another person sat in a chair facing away from the door. Michael braced himself for bad news. Perhaps they had discovered something else wrong with the machine he operated, or maybe they believed he was behind on quotas. He worried about losing his job and what that would mean for his family. He tried to keep a neutral expression. The manager greeted him and asked him to stand near the desk. Michael noticed the tension in the room. The manager's face showed no sign of anger or relief. It was simply serious. The person sitting in the chair did not turn around immediately. The manager began asking Michael about his time at the factory. How long had he worked there? What was his opinion of the work environment? Michael answered honestly, saying he had been there for years and that he tried to follow all procedures. He admitted that the environment felt tough and that workers often did not trust one another. After a few moments, the manager paused. Then he said, there was someone who wanted to speak with Michael directly. The person in the chair slowly stood up and turned around. Michael recognized him at once. It was the older man he had shared his lunch with several times. He wore the same simple uniform. But now, standing here in the manager's office, his posture and presence felt different. Michael's stomach tightened. He had many questions but said nothing. The older man nodded at Michael and smiled gently. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out an identification badge. Michael saw the name Anderson on it. The older man introduced himself as Mr. Anderson, the owner of the factory. Michael's legs felt weak. He never imagined that the friendly older worker was actually the owner. The manager stepped back, leaving Mr. Anderson and Michael face to face. Mr. Anderson explained that he had been working undercover on the factory floor, observing the employees, the conditions, and the general atmosphere. He wanted to see how people behaved when they did not know who he was. He wanted to learn if anyone treated others with respect and kindness without expecting anything in return. Michael struggled to find words. He felt embarrassed for not recognizing who Mr. Anderson was. But then again, why would he? Mr. Anderson looked like a regular employee. Michael apologized if he had done anything wrong. But Mr. Anderson raised his hand gently, indicating that Michael had nothing to apologize for. Mr. Anderson said he appreciated Michael's kindness. He had watched many employees ignore each other or act only in self-interest. Yet Michael had offered his lunch without hesitation. He had listened patiently and shown genuine concern. Mr. Anderson said that such behavior mattered more than any production number or technical skill. He told Michael that he was not in trouble. On the contrary, Mr. Anderson wanted to speak to him about an opportunity. Michael's mind raced. He thought about his mother, his sister, and the difficult conversations about finances. He thought about the stress he felt each day. He never expected this moment. Mr. Anderson asked Michael to return after lunch for a more detailed conversation. He wanted to explain how the company planned to reward him for his integrity and compassion. Michael nodded, still in shock. The manager told Michael he could go to lunch and come back later. As Michael left the office, he felt like he was in a dream. The long walk back to the cafeteria felt strange. He wondered if anyone else knew. He decided not to say anything until he understood what was happening. In the cafeteria, Michael ate quietly, barely tasting his food. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over. The older man, the quiet lunches, the friendly advice. He had been talking to the owner all along. He recalled how the man mentioned respect and empathy, how he listened without judgment. This explained why he seemed so calm and wise. After lunch, Michael returned to the manager's office as instructed. This time, the mood felt different. The manager was more relaxed. Mr. Anderson stood with his hands behind his back. He told Michael that the factory needed supervisors who understood the value of treating workers like human beings, not just numbers. He said he believed Michael was the right person to take on more responsibility. Michael felt both honored and nervous. He had never seen himself as a leader. He worried he might not have the right experience, or that others would think he was chosen unfairly. But Mr. Anderson assured him that this decision was based on character, not just technical skill. He wanted to promote Michael to a supervisor position, with better pay and the authority to make small but meaningful improvements to the work environment. Michael's eyes stung as he realized what this could mean for his family. He could pay for his mother's treatments without constant fear of debt. He could support his sister more confidently. Still, he asked if he was truly qualified. Mr. Anderson said that good leaders often came from humble backgrounds and that a fair and empathetic supervisor could improve conditions for everyone. Michael took a deep breath and accepted the offer. He thanked Mr. Anderson for the opportunity and promised to do his best. Mr. Anderson nodded and told Michael to start the following week as a trainee supervisor, working closely with a few managers to learn the ropes. He also encouraged Michael to maintain the same honesty and kindness he had always shown. As Michael left the office, he could not believe what had happened. He walked through the factory halls, thinking about how different things might be now. He had not only kept his job, he had been given a chance to make it better. The next day, Michael arrived at the factory feeling uneasy but determined. He was scheduled to begin training for his new role as a supervisor. He had not told many people about this change yet. He wanted to see how things developed before sharing the news broadly. He also worried about how his co-workers would react when they found out. He reported to a small office where the manager introduced him to another supervisor who would show him the basic responsibilities. They reviewed safety guidelines, workflow organization, and the importance of addressing worker concerns. Michael listened carefully, taking notes and asking questions. He realized that he would now have the power to propose small changes that could improve daily life for the workers. At midday, Michael went to the cafeteria as usual. This time, though, he knew that the owner had observed him here before. He thought about how he should behave now that he was becoming a supervisor. He decided that he should remain true to himself. He bought his lunch and sat at a table where some of his former co-workers ate. At first, they seemed surprised. A rumor had started circulating that Michael had met with the owner and was given a promotion. One co-worker asked if it was true. Michael nodded, admitting that he had been promoted. He said that he understood if they felt unsure about it. Another co-worker asked if Michael would become like the other supervisors who never listened. Michael shook his head and said he would try to be fair and help solve problems, not ignore them. At first, a few co-workers seemed suspicious, but over time they realized Michael was still the same person. He spoke in a calm voice, showed interest in their concerns, and did not put on airs. He asked what issues bothered them the most, writing down their comments without making promises he could not keep. He explained that changes would take time, but he was willing to try. Later, Michael crossed paths with Mr. Anderson in a hallway near the offices. Mr. Anderson wore his formal attire this time, no longer pretending to be a new employee. He asked Michael how he felt. Michael admitted he was nervous. He worried about meeting expectations and not disappointing anyone. Mr. Anderson said that fear was normal, but he trusted Michael to learn and grow. He reminded Michael that kindness and honesty mattered more than perfection. That afternoon, Michael spent time observing the production line from a different angle. Instead of working on the machine himself, he watched how others worked. He took note of small inefficiencies and potential safety hazards. He realized that a better rotation system for certain tasks might reduce physical strain. He also noticed that some workers never got proper breaks. He wondered if he could adjust the schedule slightly to give everyone a fair chance to rest. Before leaving for the day, Michael approached a manager and shared a few simple ideas, adding a short break to split a long shift in half, rotating a few workers between tasks so that no one person performed the hardest job all day, and making sure the safety equipment was easily accessible. The manager said he would consider these suggestions. Michael understood that not all ideas would be accepted immediately, but he felt satisfied that he could at least try. When Michael returned home, he told his sister and mother about his promotion. His sister looked surprised and asked how it happened. Michael explained that the owner had been testing the workers to see who showed empathy. He admitted he had treated the owner kindly without knowing who he was. His mother smiled and said she was proud. His sister relaxed, realizing that their financial situation might improve. They discussed the possibility of upgrading their mother's care or adjusting their budget to reduce stress. That night, Michael slept more soundly than he had in a long time. He still felt uncertain about the future, but now he had a reason to believe that hard work and decency could lead to positive results. He woke up the next morning determined to continue doing his best. Back at the factory, Michael began to apply what he learned in training. He walked the factory floor, spoke with a few workers, and listened to their complaints about certain processes. He asked questions to understand the problems better, and he promised to raise these issues with management. He knew he could not fix everything overnight, but he wanted his co-workers to feel heard. Over the next few days, small improvements began to appear. The manager agreed to implement a slightly different rotation schedule, giving some workers relief from the most strenuous tasks. A set of safety gloves that were previously stored too far away were moved closer to the main workstation, reducing downtime and complaints. These were small steps, but they showed that someone cared enough to make changes. Michael also began to feel more confident in his position. He learned how to handle paperwork, track production goals, and report issues to higher-level managers. He did not forget the lessons he learned on the floor. He treated his former co-workers with respect and encouraged them to voice their opinions. Gradually, he noticed that people were less guarded. They still worked hard, but there was a small improvement in morale. One afternoon, Michael saw Mr. Anderson observing from a distance. When Mr. Anderson caught Michael's eye, he nodded approvingly and left without a word. Michael understood that this was the owner's way of acknowledging that the changes were working. He realized that he had become part of something bigger than himself. He could influence the workplace culture, even if only in small ways. By the end of the day, Michael returned to the cafeteria, not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. He sat down, ate his meal, and listened to a short story from a co-worker about a family trip. He felt more at ease, knowing that his actions had helped create a slightly more open environment. He understood that he still had a long way to go, but he was on the right path, and that was enough for now. A few weeks passed since Michael started working as a supervisor. The changes he introduced were small, but they had a noticeable impact on the workers. People began to appreciate the slight improvements in their daily routines. Rotating the hardest tasks and ensuring that safety equipment was easy to access helped reduce some of the physical strain and complaints. Although the factory was still a demanding place, there were signs of progress. Michael spent his time between the office and the production floor. He held short discussions with workers, listened to their suggestions, and took notes to bring up in his weekly meetings with the managers. Not all ideas could be implemented immediately. Sometimes he had to explain why certain requests would take longer or might not happen at all. Still, workers appreciated that someone was finally paying attention to their concerns. At home, Michael's life also improved. With the increase in pay from his promotion, he could afford better medical care for his mother. He and his sister stopped arguing as much about money because they no longer felt the same level of fear over the next month's bills. Michael noticed that his mother's health was stabilizing with the right treatments, and he felt relief at being able to provide for her without constant worry. One evening, after a long day at the factory, Michael sat in the small living room with his mother and sister. They talked about ordinary things, like what to cook for dinner and whether his mother needed anything special from the pharmacy. These simple conversations felt more relaxed than before. Michael realized that the tension that once filled their home had eased. He attributed this to the fact that he no longer carried the same hopelessness he had before. There was still work to be done, both at home and at the factory, but he felt he was moving in the right direction. Back at the factory, Michael noticed that workers who previously ignored each other started to communicate more openly. It was not a dramatic transformation, but enough that people would occasionally help one another without grumbling. He saw a co-worker assist another with adjusting a machine, and someone else share a spare pair of gloves with a new hire who did not have the right gear. These small acts reminded Michael of the time he shared his lunch with Mr. Anderson, not knowing he was the owner. Mr. Anderson appeared in the factory occasionally, now dressed in his formal attire, and observed the operations from a distance. Sometimes he called Michael into a brief meeting to check on progress. He never pressured Michael for unrealistic changes. Instead, he encouraged him to keep looking for practical ways to improve conditions. Michael appreciated this guidance. Knowing that the owner supported his efforts made him feel more confident in his role. During a lunch break, Michael sat at a table with a few workers he used to know only by sight. Now they chatted about simple topics, sports events, local news, and their families. Michael listened more than he spoke, but he contributed when he had something to add. One worker asked if Michael had any new plans for the production line. Michael said he was still evaluating a few ideas, but he needed management approval before implementing anything new. The worker understood. He said he respected the fact that Michael tried to give honest answers instead of false promises. Another worker mentioned that things were at least more bearable now compared to a few months ago. Michael nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment, even though he knew there was still much to improve. That afternoon, Michael walked the floor, checking that everyone had what they needed. He noticed that a particularly heavy lifting job was scheduled too often for the same person. He made a note to rotate that assignment more frequently. He also spotted a set of tools stored in a corner that was hard to reach. He planned to suggest moving them to a central area. As he finished his rounds, Michael reflected on his journey. He remembered when he first arrived at this factory, feeling unnoticed and unimportant. He recalled eating alone in the cafeteria and struggling with the machine breakdown incident. At that time, he never imagined he would be able to influence anything here. Now he had a voice and some authority, and he used them to help others rather than to control or intimidate. At home that evening, Michael helped his mother sort her medications. She thanked him for making her life a bit easier. He told her he was trying his best, both at home and at work. His sister smiled, acknowledging that their situation was better now. They all understood that their problems were not gone, but they managed them with less fear and more hope. A few months later, the factory's atmosphere showed further improvement. While it was still a busy and challenging workplace, more workers seemed willing to look out for each other. Productivity had not suffered from the small changes. In fact, in some areas it had improved slightly. The managers took note of this and began to trust Michael's judgment when he suggested minor adjustments. Michael's responsibilities as a supervisor became more routine. He learned the paperwork side of the job and understood how to track metrics and quality standards. He knew which requests had a chance of approval and which would take longer. He also learned how to communicate these things clearly to the workers. He never promised what he could not deliver, and he never claimed to have all the answers. This honesty earned him respect. At lunchtime, Michael no longer sat alone at a corner table. He joined a group of workers who talked freely with him. They sometimes asked for his opinion on small matters, and he listened with genuine interest. He felt that he belonged here now. He was not simply surviving, he was part of a community, even if it was far from perfect. One day, Mr. Anderson made an unannounced visit. He walked around with the general manager and a few supervisors, greeting workers and asking simple questions. He did not single Michael out, but when their eyes met, he gave a brief nod of approval. Michael understood that Mr. Anderson's presence was a reminder that compassion and character still mattered in this factory. After that visit, Michael asked a few of his co-workers if they felt the difference in the workplace. They said they did. One commented that people seemed less likely to undercut each other's efforts. Another said that knowing someone was willing to listen made them feel less like a number. Michael smiled at these remarks. He knew the factory had a long way to go, but every step counted. At home, Michael's mother's health had stabilized due to consistent care. He and his sister maintained a calm approach to expenses now that they had a slightly better financial cushion. Michael still woke up early and worked long hours, but the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. He no longer lay awake at night imagining losing his job. Instead, he focused on doing his best to keep things moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, small changes continued to accumulate. Workers learned that if they brought a reasonable request to Michael, he would at least consider it. Some suggestions were simple, like adjusting the timing of a break or asking for better maintenance on a particular machine. Others were more complex, requiring further analysis. Michael handled them all patiently. One afternoon, while reviewing a monthly report, Michael realized that productivity had not only remained steady, but slightly improved. He considered that happier or at least less frustrated workers might take fewer shortcuts and make fewer mistakes. He brought this observation to the managers. They agreed that a better work environment might actually help production. In the long run, Michael stood in the factory's cafeteria at the end of his shift, looking around at the workers finishing their meals. He noticed that the general mood had shifted since the day he first offered his lunch to a stranger. That one simple gesture had led him to meet Mr. Anderson. He thought about how that unexpected encounter changed his life. He had proved that character could matter. By doing what felt right, he had opened a door that transformed his role in the factory and helped improve life for others. As he gathered his belongings and headed toward the exit, Michael felt a sense of belonging. He had started as a lone worker, unseen and unimportant. Now he was a supervisor who tried to consider people's needs, a man who could look his co-workers in the eye and feel he was part of something that, while still not perfect, was at least more respectful and decent than before. He stepped outside into the evening air. The day's shift had ended, and workers were leaving in small groups. Some waved goodbye to each other, and a few called out Michael's name, thanking him for something small he had done. He waved back, smiling politely. He understood that his journey was not about grand gestures or radical changes. It was about small steps that added up over time. Michael thought about his mother at home, how she would be waiting for him, and how he could provide for her now without constant fear. He considered his future here. He might stay at the factory for years, continuing to improve conditions bit by bit. He might find other opportunities later. But for now, he felt satisfied with the way things had turned out. When he returned home, he prepared a simple meal and sat down with his mother and sister. They asked about his day, and he told them about a minor improvement he managed to implement for the workers. His mother smiled, proud of him. His sister relaxed, knowing that he was at peace with his work. As the evening ended, Michael realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had not become wealthy or changed the entire system, but he had made a difference in his own corner of the world. He had proved that kindness and character mattered in a place that once seemed too rigid to change. With that thought, he settled in for the night, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring.